did that yesterday in an in a what do you call it? A testimony, yeah, in an open hearing. Hold on a minute. Literally, you're going 2 doors down. It says leave class, so I will go now. Yeah, so Comey sort of checked the power of the presidency yesterday by coming out and saying that there was no evidence of Obama wiretapping Trump Tower. Do you believe that? Do you believe that Donald Trump was being spied upon prior to becoming president of the United States?
By Obama?
No, not necessarily by Obama, but by the government. No? Do we believe it?
I mean, how far back are we talking?
Let's go this far back. Let's say at some point in time between the election of 2016 and 2003.
Yeah.
Who said?
I said that the government apparently spies on like everyone, so
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the correct answer. I'm sure they were spying. Well, he was going to run in 2012, but then he kind of backed out. So, okay, yesterday we talked about the imperial presidency, right? The president that has gained too much power. What we're going to talk about today are some of the responses to it. The War Powers Act, you need to understand this. They love putting this on the AP test, and I'm not really 100% certain why. I guess because it's some sort of response to presidential overstep of power, and it goes back to this ideology of sort of the conflict between the two branches, between the two offices, okay, and how they have to interact with one another and how they have to deal with one another. All right, so just a little bit of background so we understand. The War Powers Act comes out in the 1970s. Right, so actually 1973, which if you remember correctly yesterday, and I don't expect you to remember this, that's also when the book that created this idea of the imperial president came out. Alright? But what you should understand is that it's the War Powers Act comes on the heels of Vietnam. Right? So if you understand Vietnam, if you're actually, you can take an entire college class just on the Vietnam War. And if you were ever take that college class, you would actually understand that the Vietnam War was over 20 years long. Right? Most of us don't really think about it as being that long a war. We think that the Vietnam War basically went from 65 to 71. Okay? In reality, it went from about 1952, because that's the first time U.S. service members stepped foot on Vietnamese soil, all the way up until like 1975, when Saigon actually fell and Vietnam became one unified communist country. Alright? But basically what we realized by the early 70s is that the President of the United States has essentially gotten us involved in a war that we've got no business being in. And a war that we really can't win. Alright? Because after World War II, and you've heard me mention this before, the United States will never win another war. Alright? Because after World War II, we don't try to win wars anymore. Alright? And what I mean when I say that is if you look historically, the purpose of war is to annihilate some other group of people. Right? It's actually General Patton who said that the purpose of war is not to die honorably on the field of battle for your country. The purpose of war is to make some other fool die honorably on the field of battle for his country. We don't fight wars in that manner anymore. In fact, when I was in the Marine Corps, we spent a significant amount of our time, and despite the fact that we ran around calling ourselves the world's fiercest fighting force, we spent a significant amount of our time training to be police officers. Which is really comical if you think about it, because we train our police officers today to be essentially a military, and we train our military to be police officers. And this is the reason why we won't win wars. We went into Vietnam not in order to annihilate the Vietnamese. In fact, we didn't even go into North Vietnam. And sure, we bombed North Vietnam, but we didn't go into North Vietnam. And instead, what we did, if you actually really understand the Vietnamese wars, we basically wandered around South Vietnam, which was our own territory, right, our allies, and we went to little villages, and we just indiscriminately killed some people because we thought they might be North Vietnamese sympathizers. But we really had no evidence of this. Right? And so it becomes this terrible sort of travesty in American history, and Congress realizes that this is highly problematic, that basically as a commander-in-chief, a president can do this to us, and we have no recourse, there's no action that we can take. So Congress passes the War Powers Act. Alright? And so what this says is there's a number of provisions to it, but basically now if the President of the United States puts American service members into what would be designated as a combat zone, he has to notify Congress within 48 hours. And the President of the United States can only keep troops there for 60 days, unless Congress gives him approval to keep them there longer. Alright? And Congress can actually pass a resolution that the President cannot veto that says the President has to move the troops out. Now, understand that this creates a significant amount of problems, because we exist in a country that was established based on our Constitution as something to where we wanted to have checks and balances, yes? So we wanted government to be at odds with itself from time to time. But now we have a piece of legislation that says Congress can force the President to move troops. Who's responsible for moving troops? Solely the President. Yet we have legislation that says Congress can now do it. Which in all honesty means that the War Powers Resolution, the War Powers Act of 1973, might actually be unconstitutional. Okay? It makes it very difficult for the President to act as Commander-in-Chief. Okay? It makes it incredibly difficult to successfully engage somewhere, because if you are a foreign power and you know that the President can only keep troops there for 60 days, well, all you have to do is wait 60 days. And you can actually withstand a siege for 60 days. It's not that difficult. Alright? Now here's the thing, I told you a second ago, this may be unconstitutional, right? Nobody's ever challenged it. So we don't really know. It just kind of exists. Because like we talked about yesterday, does Congress actually tell the President no? Did Congress make the President pull troops out of Somalia after 60 days? No. Did Congress make the President pull troops out of Afghanistan or Iraq after 60 days? No. Routinely, doesn't happen. So it's never been challenged, it's never been an issue. Alright? We have the National Emergencies Act. Again, we talked about this. The President can sort of declare a state of emergency and utilize what are identified as emergency powers. We now have limits on that. So you can't have an indefinite state of emergency, like we have an indefinite war on terror right now. That just doesn't work. Okay? If an emergency is permanent, it's not really an emergency, it's just kind of life. Alright? Congress and the CIA. The CIA is obviously an executive branch. I'm not going to go into great detail, although you could, if you want to on your own, you could sort of look up the history of the CIA. It is fascinating. In the 70s and 80s, the CIA may or may not have been responsible for the assassination of at least a half dozen world leaders. Okay? And I say may or may not have been. Because we don't really know. And the truth of the matter is the American people, if you know what the CIA is doing, the CIA is terrible at its job. Okay? Just like if you know what SEAL Team 6 is doing, SEAL Team 6 is terrible at its job. Right? There are things and aspects of this that you should have absolutely no knowledge of. Alright? But because of the problems of this time, again, Congress is going to react to what they see as an agency sort of out of control, and we end up with congressional oversight. Alright? A little overkill in congressional oversight initially. But now even the actions of the CIA or other sort of clandestine organizations are subject to congressional review because they are, they are executive agencies, and that is a part of our constitutional system. Congress is responsible for oversight. The passage of the Budget and Impoundment Act, we talked about impoundment yesterday. I told you that it is now illegal. Okay, that's all I really care for you to understand with this. Okay, you can't, the president can't impound funds permanently, and Congress now has the CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office. It's a nonpartisan office that is only supposed to exist to crunch numbers and be objective. Okay, it's not supposed to be partisan. It does not work with one party or the other. It does not work with the party that is in control. It simply tries to provide non-biased, basically mathematical or statistical information. Alright? Confirmation of presidential appointees. We talked about how the Senate can hold that, how that's a response, how that's part of our conflict. Understand that with the imperial presidency, there is a basic courtesy, and there are a lot of traditions in terms of how our government functions that are basic courtesies. If the President of the United States is appointing somebody to a position within your individual state, right? So, district attorney for the state of New York, right, or whatever that district is up there. But I know that there is a district court in Manhattan. When the president appoints somebody to that position, he will meet with the senators from New York kind of as a courtesy first. Alright? That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to agree. New York is obviously very liberal. Our president is not. I don't assume that the President of the United States is going to appoint some sort of liberal attorney to be the DA in that area. Alright? But with any sort of appointment now, especially outside of the cabinet, we have a lot more scrutiny over what is occurring. Historically, somebody like Neil Gorsuch, who is the current nominee for the Supreme Court, would have been approved almost instantaneously. Okay? Even Democrats will tell you today that Neil Gorsuch is qualified. Right? He has a good legal understanding. He has an understanding of how our Constitution works. He knows the law. He's qualified to be a judge. Okay? But that's not really good enough anymore. Because simply being intellectually intelligent and sound in terms of understanding what your job is, yeah, I know, it was a little redundant. Okay? But aside from just being smart or understanding your position, what the job entails that you're going to be doing, your actual ideologies now matter. Okay? So the rule of fitness doesn't suffice anymore. Okay? And that's this idea, of course it's just fit. Right? He's been a Supreme Court clerk, he's been a lawyer, he's been a judge, he's fit to be a Supreme Court justice. Okay? But now, instead, his actual policy preferences matter. And if you sit and you listen to these hearings, they ask him, how do you feel? Are you pro-life? Are you pro-choice? Which is an individual opinion that on some level shouldn't matter. That doesn't determine whether or not he's qualified to be a judge. All right? But because we've become so partisan, that is actually an important part of the process anymore. And what you see is we have long confirmational delays anymore. In fact, so long that Merrick Garland never even got a hearing. And do not think that the Republicans were just messing with the Democrats. It goes both ways. And by all accounts, the Republicans in the Senate, I mean, Mitch McConnell won't say this. McConnell still claims that he's going to get his 60 votes. I don't know what 8 Democrats are going to go with him. But McConnell and the Republicans, because of some of these issues, they can actually change the rules now. Alright? I don't know that they're going to, but they can. And a legislative veto. Now this is a concept that's sometimes tricky to understand, because we know vetoes is something the president does to legislation, correct? And now, we've talked about how Congress passes laws. Those laws are a little vague anymore. They go to the individual agency that's going to execute those laws, right? And for all of you, when you turn in your little bill at the end of this week, you should have in there, right, there should be a subsection to your bill about who is going to execute your bill. Because somebody has to execute it, right? If you pass a piece of legislation and there's no execution to it, does it actually get done? No. Right? So if you're going to write a bill about education, it might need to go to the Department of Education. If you're going to write a bill about the environment, it might need to go to the EPA. Okay? But we write sort of vague legislation anymore, and then it goes to the agency, and the agency basically comes up with what it wants to do. Alright? And then Congress would come back and they would veto regulations. They'd be like, nah, that's not what we want. Alright? And so it's an attempt for Congress to force the bureaucracy to implement the law the way that it wants. Alright? The Supreme Court said that's not okay. So Congress basically came back and created an act that allows Congress to repeal regulations with presidential approval, which is essentially just saying that it's writing a whole nother piece of legislation saying that this was not the intent. Alright? Foreign affairs. So we talked about how the president generally gets what he wants in foreign affairs. In terms of the imperial presidency and overstepping boundaries, the instance in which this is generally cut off, or we say that the president has overstepped his boundaries, is when it comes to appropriations or basically aid to other countries. All right, Congress will cut that off because they think that the president is overstepping his boundaries in terms of foreign affairs, giving out too much money or doing things that are detrimental to the United States. All right. And this is one of the things that led to the whole Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s, and whether or not the Reagan administration was illegally channeling money to the Contras in order to fight communism down in Nicaragua. All right. Now, what can happen here is as Congress tries to re-exert control, all right, we do have arguments of sort of an imperial Congress as well. And this is inevitably the problem that's always going to arise. Somebody has to wield the power, and somebody is going to be unhappy about whoever is wielding that power. All right? One of the things that can happen with our imperial Congress, Congress can basically just investigate things to death anymore. All right? And I'll use Starr's Whitewater investigation as sort of an example of this. We spent just boatloads of money to investigate Bill Clinton because he did what? He cheated on his wife. All right, so he's a terrible husband. I don't care. That's it. We wasted all sorts of time and resources because Bill Clinton is a lousy husband. Alright? Doesn't matter. With the other argument with the Imperial Congress, and you can definitely see this right now with, and it's really playing out in a partisan way, but this excessive scrutiny over presidential appointments, especially when it comes to cabinet level picks. Look, you guys know that I rail against some of the people that Trump put in his cabinet. I don't like them. Right? But if I was in the Senate, I'd have voted for him. With the exception of one. She was just grossly unqualified. Okay? But the rest of them, even though I don't like them and I don't necessarily agree with their policies, they were qualified for the position that they were put in. In which case, if that's how Trump wants to run his White House, he should be allowed to run his White House that way. It's his office, basically. Okay? But we have excessive scrutiny now to presidential appointments and delays. We've now set, have we hit a year yet? I think we've hit a year. I want to say Scalia died like a year ago. So we've now hit a year of having a Supreme Court with 8 members. And multiple decisions that have rendered at a 4-4 tie. That's terribly inefficient for our government. Alright? The excessive investigations, the witch hunts, this is, again, what I would talk about in terms of, like the Whitewater and the Clinton investigation. And on the bright side, it's much more difficult now to get an independent counselor. Not impossible though. All right. And then in terms of Imperial Congress, there is a bit of micromanagement because Congress has subpoena power. Do we know what that means? Somebody said yes. Yeah, Congress could subpoena me. Like they could literally send a piece of paper here that says you have to come to Washington D.C. and you have to testify about the state of education in Texas or whatever. Okay, and I don't have an option. I gotta go. And when they ask me a question, I gotta tell them the truth, right? Otherwise, it's perjury. Not that that apparently matters anymore, but I have to tell them the truth. I have to show up. Okay. Would it really be beneficial for Congress to subpoena me? No, no. I don't have any real power over what's going on anywhere other than outside of this or inside of this room. Right? What? I don't know how that works. I would assume, I would hope that they paid for it, but if they didn't, I could actually write it all off on my taxes. Because it would be a requirement like that. That's something that I would not have to pay for. Right? So basically, well, I mean, I'd have to pay for it. Writing it off on your taxes isn't that great of a deal, but whatever. Alright, so there we go. Told you yesterday we were going to do this. In fact, actually, well, here's the deal, guys, because you notice, we're going to do A, all right? You notice the verb here, right?